Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Okay, welcome back to the Examined Life with Phil. This week I'm going to be playing the second part of my discussion with Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy on Theistic Evolution, and here we get into topics like abiogenesis, the philosophical critiques of evolution, we take a slight detour into philosophy of mind, and he gives his critiques of young earth creationism. And so cover a lot of ground, and relatively quickly in fact, but still a very good discussion. Now I promise you I'm not going to bury the lead here. I'll be playing that really quick. I've just got a couple of housekeeping things to handle first, real quick here. First of all, I want to mention that I do have a guest secured to give the intelligent design perspective. That should be coming up in about 2 weeks. That's David Paulman. And then the week thereafter, I'm going to be talking to Peter Razor about his book, The Controversy of the Ages, which tries to look at all the various perspectives on this from a Christian viewpoint. And Peter Razor was the guy I had on a few months back to talk about Molinism, so it'll be nice to be talking to him again. But next week, the very next episode, I've got a special treat because I've got an interview with J.P. Moreland that I did on his recent book on anxiety. And Dr. Moreland and I covered quite a bit of ground in relation to his book and some other things, and it was a great pleasure to have him on talking, so you should be able to hear that next week, and I'm really looking forward to that. The other thing I want to mention is that the details on this are still being a little worked out, but we've got the date settled. On December the 2nd, I'm going to be doing a debate on inerrancy with David Van and Bieber, or Beber. My apologies, David. I'm horrible at pronouncing last names, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. Anyhow, David reached out to me and asked me if I would do a debate with him on inerrancy, based on an essay I gave on biblical inerrancy at the Society for Pentecostal Studies way back in March of this year. Well, I guess March isn't that long ago. If you want to know more about what I think about that, you can go back and listen to episode 30, 2 points on biblical inerrancy. And so I'm pretty excited about this. David and I have had some cordial exchanges over Messenger and email discussing the points on this, what we think, and how to set up the debate and things along those lines. And while we do disagree, I'd say pretty adamantly, he's gracious enough and kind enough that I think we'll be able to have a pretty substantive exchange and debate that should be edifying and help a lot of people learn about the importance of this issue. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll let you know more details as they come about. It's likely we'll either have that at a live venue or we'll do it in some type of a fashion over Facebook Live or something like that. And as more details come about, I'll let you know about that. And the first part of Michael and I's discussion last week was easily one of the most popular episodes I've had of this podcast in a while, so thanks you to everybody for tuning in and listening and commenting and downloading it. I very much appreciate that. I did notice that quite a few of the comments people left behind were things praising young earth creation and things like that, which is perfectly fine. I'm happy to get any kind of feedback. However, I'm still looking for a young earth creation advocate to come on the podcast and pitch their best pitch for young earth creationism. It's a viewpoint that Christian theists take, and so even though I critiqued it with Michael, and I personally think it's the weakest of the views, I think it should get its fair hearing and fair share, so I'm looking for a proponent to come on and give their best pitch for it. And so far, the young earth creationists I've approached have turned me down, indicating they don't want to come on the program. So for everyone who's listening and leaving those comments knocking theistic evolution in favor of young earth creationism, write in, let me know of who you think the best advocates for this viewpoint are so I can reach out to them and see if they'd want to come on the podcast. Because, as I said, I do want to give the viewpoint its best case, its fairest shake, and so I'd like to get the best advocate for it I can on here. So if you have any ideas there, write in, let me know. I think that'd be a good and healthy way to add to the discussion and the debate. So I appreciate any help you guys can give me there. So, without any further delay, I'm going to play the next part of Michael and I's discussion on theistic evolution.
Recently, there was a paper this year called, the title of the paper was Direct Prebiotic Pathways to DNA Nucleosides. And what they are arguing is that there's a lot of self-assembly processes in nature that can give rise to DNA just as a result of natural processes. It doesn't need to come about from random chance. Nature might be fine-tuned to bring about DNA as an inevitable result, and this paper is evidence towards that view.
Oh, what is the evidence they cite in that? That'd be very interesting, yeah.
The title of the paper is Direct Prebiotic Pathways to DNA Nucleosides, and they argue there's different self-assembly processes in nature that just give rise to DNA nucleosides. So they show up and natural prebiotic world there. And other self-assembly processes could be discovered in the future that could show how they could form DNA. But this is a reoccurring thing that keeps happening in abiogenesis. We keep finding more and more self-assembly processes. You know how snowflakes sort of form through self-assembly? They're not random chance. It's nature sort of fine-tunes them to create these interesting-looking crystals. Well, there's a lot of self-assembly processes that we keep finding that was in the prebiotic world that sort of brought about a lot of the basic building blocks of life. And this is another paper demonstrating that.
Okay. Now, I've heard some of that kind of stuff before, but the objection I kind of have to it is, well, something about that kind of seems counterintuitive. Like, you go out in the nature in the world and you can see that kind of thing to some degree, but when you're talking about things like assembling DNA or the first cell of life or something like that, you're talking about a radically, radically different thing than, a snowflake or a crystal.
Right. And one thing I remind people is that nature has shown us time and time again it's counterintuitive. Case in point, quantum mechanics. Okay, quantum mechanics is very counterintuitive. Intuition is a good starting point. We need to start with our intuition and build from there. But if our intuition is shown to be wrong in some area, then we abandon that specific intuition. Not all of our intuition, but that specific intuition, and go where the evidence is pointing.
Yeah, that's a good philosophical principle where you go with your intuition, what your senses tell you, and things along those lines until you have good evidence to point you in another direction, which is why I know the world isn't flat, even though sometimes when I look at it, it certainly appears so.
Oh, and living in Arizona, I completely agree. Sometimes I'm just driving along the highway and you can see for miles and it looks flat, but I know it's round. I'm not a moron.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's interesting. The other objection I've heard that might be raised to, and for listeners who don't know, abiogenesis is the study of how life could have arisen. But the other objection I've heard about that is that life seems to require information, at least in the sense of our genome and our DNA, and information just doesn't come from nowhere. Every time we've ever observed information anywhere, it always comes from either other information or an agent somewhere. So how would it then be the case that these self-organizing processes developed information?
Well, let me just, before I get to what DNA is, because I think when people think of DNA as sort of like information or code, they're kind of missing the point when evolutionary biologists talk about it like that. But just think of it from a theistic perspective. Could God not imbue natural processes to bring about information? Obviously. I mean, obviously, as theists, we agree there is an intelligent being behind the universe. And so there is obviously information already there. And if nature is contingent upon him, then nature itself is contingent upon a being that would have information to begin with. So God could already imbue nature to bring about information as it is. But when physicists talk about DNA, it's not really code like we use. They use that as an analogy that's run wild. And then it sort of explains what DNA is. But reality, it's not. It goes back to the snowflake example. You can sort of see interesting patterns form, but those can come about from self-assembly. So when we talk about DNA, it's not really a code. We're using it in sort of like a metaphorical sense in a lot of way. And so you can look at some of the stuff that, Christian and chemist Sigart has pointed out. It's not really code. I mean, we want to call it code because that's an easy way to explain it to the public, but it's not like a code that someone was printing on a computer.
So if I'm understanding your response correctly, you're kind of then rejecting the analogy that it's information, saying, well, no, that's an analogy people use, that biologists and biochemists use to try to help people understand what DNA is, but it's not really information, and certainly not in the same sense that the notes I typed and sent to you about our talk are.
Right. I mean, Dr. Herman Mays has also talked about this. Like I mentioned Sigard. I think they did a hangout on the Non Sequitur show a while ago where they talked about, it's not really a code, but we like to call it a code because that sort of fits the description. So I would recommend people look at what the evolutionary biologists are talking about. And a lot of young Earth creationists do is they hear the colloquial sense, or the evolutionary biology is trying to dumb it down for us. And they run wild with it.
Okay. Yeah, I got that idea from critiques I've heard of from intelligent design advocates where they say, well, DNA is essentially information, and therefore we can then apply all these critiques that are valid in information theory to DNA, and that's where you get all these problems. And you're saying, well, that doesn't work because it's not really code and information, not in the same sense that we try and talk about, and so it doesn't work with all these problems you can bring in with information theory and philosophy and stuff like that.
Right. And I also try to remind people this is that God can fine tune or create through natural laws. He doesn't necessarily have to step into nature every couple million years and create new organisms.
Mm-hmm.
What God sounds more intelligent? A God who can snap his fingers at the Big Bang and go, yeah, it's going to work out how I want it to. And then when I'm ready, I'll develop a relationship with the end result. Or God is going to go, I got to step in and I have to create the Cambrian explosion. Now I got to step in and create dinosaurs. Ooh, I don't know. They got a little big. Let me step in and create mammals.
Yeah, I can see your point there. That's one of those things that I'm kind of inclined to say that'd be a little bit subjective. That's like, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the critique between like contemporary analytic philosophers of religion and classical Thomistic philosophers of religion. Well, which God's more perfect, the totally immutable God or the personal God? And I'm like, well, you can kind of go either way on that. I know my Thomistic friends hate it when I say that, where I'm like, I just don't know how to decide which God's more perfect there. But I can see the sense you're appealing to at the same time, where you're like, yeah, that in a certain way, that does seem a little bit like it'd be a little bit wiser, require a lot more pre-planning, those kind of things.
Right.
Okay. And what was I going to... Oh, I had another thought, which is, I guess one of the nice things about being a theistic Christian in all this is you can kind of, in a certain sense, well, maybe this isn't a nice thing, but all the views are, so to speak, open to you from the get-go because you can usually just find a way to appeal to God for any of them. So if you wanted to be a theistic evolutionist who said, well, God steps in and does the mutations, I don't think that's a very good theory for other reasons. It's kind of ad hoc, but at least you could say, hey, it kind of works.
Right, you could say that.
Okay. The other critique I've heard of evolutionary theories are more philosophical, and they come from like the likes of the good philosopher Thomas Nagel, where he argued in that great book Mind and Cosmos that mind is fundamental to reality and standard evolutionary theory. And I think he might have actually been referring to neo-Darwinism, so maybe he's missing the mark here too. But he argues that it doesn't account for mind because it's strictly a materialistic theory. And well, he denies connections to intelligent design theory. I think he's also said elsewhere, these people are pointing to problems in the theory and everybody should listen to them a little more. So what do you say to that?
Right. I remember in his book, he specifically talks about like science, consciousness, cognition, value, these four things that, neo-Darwinist account can never explain. And I agree with him on all of these points. You can't explain where value comes from a naturalist perspective, as well as consciousness in the natural world itself. That all makes sense. And I don't think consciousness evolved. I want to be very clear. I don't think it evolved. I think it's fundamental in and of itself. What I think evolved is brain. I think the brain slowly evolved over time, and then conscious agents got better and more intelligent and were able to function more within the natural environment. So what evolved is our brains, our souls, so to speak. So if we define a soul as your personality, your thoughts, your emotions, your dreams, your goals, all of this stuff is your soul. That's why I think the word soul is used in the New Testament. That clearly evolves over time just in you. You're not the same soul you were 20 years ago. You have new thoughts, dreams, emotions that have been added into there. So that can evolve over time, but the conscious agent behind the soul is fundamental and does not reduce to smaller parts in that sense. So that's one thing I tell people to keep in mind is that I don't argue that consciousness had to evolve. I don't think it is. I agree with Thomas Nagel that it's really hard to argue how the consciousness could come from natural processes.
Okay. So you kind of accept his critique there. And then to explain consciousness, when you say it's fundamental, you mean it's fundamental like matter is fundamental, the law of gravity is fundamental, or what are you getting at there?
I mean, it's irreducible. So you can't really reduce it to smaller parts like you can matter. You can reduce it down to atoms. You can reduce it down to subatomic particles and quarks and smaller particles. So it keeps getting reducible. consciousness is not reducible to smaller parts, is my point. It just simply is. It's fundamental in and of itself.
Okay. So would that be similar to like a philosophical brute fact then?
Yes.
I mean, that's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? That's kind of a rough way of putting it, where, all philosophers want to avoid brute facts, but so.
Right,
Okay.
but I don't think you can reduce consciousness to anything. And there's some interesting evidence I could give to this and whatnot. We could always do a future podcast on that.
Oh yeah, that'd be great if we could do that at some point. I'm actually going to be talking to J.P. Moreland next week, who's a great philosopher of mine. So it'll be on his new book on anxiety, but I won't be able to resist the urge to put a few questions to him on philosophy of mind, because
of course,
it's J.P. Moreland. So what else are you going to do? And yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you there that consciousness is definitely not something that's reducible to matter. I've been to many philosophy conferences, and it seems like, well, maybe not as many as other people have been, but the ones I've been to anyway, a lot of my philosopher friends, the theory of mind that seems to be prevalent among them now is emergentism, which is, as you know, but some other people might not, the idea that the immaterial mind just emerges from the matter of the brain. And I can't quite understand why they find that so appealing, because that just seems so obviously counterintuitive to me. Immaterial is by definition the opposite of material.
Right.
How are you going to get the two of them to equal each other or give rise to each other?
Right, and there's a lot of studies that have shown the problems with that. I remember some studies on psilocybin, which is a hallucinogen, and they give this hallucinogenic drug to subjects and study them, and you would expect, if you're having psychedelic experiences, that brain activity would increase. Mm-hmm. Well, the studies they did showed that the exact opposite happened. Brain activity actually decreased on this drug, even though blood flow increased, even though heart rate increased. So obviously the conscious agent was having very stress-induced experiences, but the brain activity decreased. And that did not correlate with the idea that consciousness emerged from the brain. It was a problem for them, and still is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've heard many similar arguments as to why the mind must be immaterial. And some of them are just so obvious. Like, if you just think about the fact that your thoughts aren't really located anywhere. Well, material has to be located somewhere. Or that
right. No one has a thought behind another thought, mm-hmm. or memories next to each other.
Exactly, yeah. Or the fact that your thoughts aren't divisible in the sense that matter is. It's not like you can pull your thought out and start chopping it apart like we actually could with your brain, if that's where the thoughts were. And so many other things like that, where it's just, at least it's always seemed to me, these arguments are so intuitively obvious, I can't for the life of me understand why things like emergentism and physicalism are so popular in contemporary philosophy of mind. So
right. And if we did find evidence that went against that intuition, I would be inclined to agree. But it seems the evidence keeps confirming that intuition. Mm-hmm. The mind is not reducible mm-hmm. to matter.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, is there anything else you wanted to say about like critiques of ID or other things along these lines before we move on?
The only thing I would say is, if you want, there's a really good paper by Sygart. Now, he's a Christian, and he's writing to Christians on evolutionary biology. The paper is called New Ideas in Evolutionary Biology. And so check that out. It's by Sygart, and he sort of explains why we don't really have to posit neo-Darwinism. There's much more complicated and extended theories of evolution that explain far more data that ID advocates tend to overlook.
Okay, and how did you spell his name?
It's S-Y.
Mm-hmm.
That's his first name, and then Gart is his last name. That's G-A-R-T-E.
G-A-R-T-E. Okay, I'll probably look into that, yeah. Because the way you're describing the newer attempts to, I'm not sure what the correct term here would be, but these newer variations in theories of evolution are far more appealing to me, because, as I think I mentioned earlier, I've just had this thought for a while. Yeah, neo-Darwinism does not work. So why aren't biologists and evolutionary biologists out there looking for ways to make it work? Why aren't they looking for these new processes? And you're telling me, no, they really are. I'm just been unaware of it. So
right, and the paper is only like 7 pages long, so it's really short, but it covers a lot of data really quickly. He's a very good author.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely check that out. Okay, well, moving on. This is the view that I know definitely gets beaten up on quite a bit, but what would you say your critiques are of young Earth creationism? And I know typically when I talk to young Earth creationists, they immediately want to appeal to something like, that's what Genesis says, and Genesis is God's word, therefore I'm going to believe that over what scientists at Harvard or wherever are saying, or something similar to that.
It just goes to show you that the first thing they go to is their interpretation of an ancient text. It's not, oh no, we found really good evidence the Earth is young. I'm like, really? So I remember even the opponents of Galileo in letters said, like, if we were even wrong and Galileo's right, it just means our interpretation of Scripture is wrong. They're 10 times better off than a lot of young Earth creationists are, because they have equated their interpretation with the Word of God, which is a scary, borderline cultic view. You've got to accept that maybe your interpretation could be wrong. That's the best position to take. Maybe you just got the text wrong. And that's what traditionally Christians have understood. So that's where young Earth creationists have to go. Their view is not doing too well. They have to assume their interpretation is on the same level of God's word, which is kind of scary. So that's one of their first problems. And the other problem is no one takes the entire creation account literally. As I mentioned earlier, Genesis 2:24, a man and a woman shall become one flesh. No one takes that literally. No one can. And that's right in Genesis 2. I've heard young Earth creationists try to weasel out of this. They'll be like, no, that means procreation because a man and a woman have a child. And that's one flesh. Okay, you're taking the idea of a man and a woman joining together and becoming one flesh as a metaphor for procreation. Even if you're right, that's still a metaphor, whether you want to admit it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So no one takes it literally, despite their protests.
Yeah, I don't think you ever can take any text completely literally, at least not unless it's like something like a technical manual on how to repair a car or something along those lines. Certainly not an ancient text anyway, because they're just not written that way.
Oh, exactly. And so young Earth creationists tend to think that, the ages are literal. We can calculate the age of the Earth. What I go is, well, how old is it? Because if you were going to calculate the age of the Earth via the Greek Septuagint, which is our oldest complete Old Testament, the age of the Earth is actually close to 8,000 years old. So it's actually much older than the Masoretic text, which is dates to maybe around the year 1000 AD. So the Masoretic text is a far older text. It says the Earth is 6,000 years old. But the much older, much earlier Greek Septuagint says the Earth is about 7,750 years old. So what are you going on? The ages don't really function as literal ages if there's a lot of fluidity between the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Greek Septuagint, and the Masoretic text.
Yeah. And then somebody asked me about this in a book discussion group I was in a while back, probably a couple of months ago, and I told them, I'd call myself an old Earth creationist because when I read Genesis, I don't read a date there. And the other dates that come later are clearly not, even if you want to take it in about as literal a sense as you can, they're clearly not intended to be there to try to give you a date for this creation event. They're there for other purposes. And that's even if they were like reject your whole idea that these ages aren't literal. They're still not there to try to give you a date as to when this happened.
Right. And a lot of early church fathers didn't take Genesis literally. They took it allegorically. So this is long before the theory of evolution came on the scene, and we were already being taught that this was not meant to be taken absolutely literally. Even during the same time as Christ, there was a guy named Philo of Alexandria who was teaching this.
Okay, cool, good deal. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that at least, maybe not all, but a significant portion of young Earth creationists just kind of assume that their interpretation of the text is the only right one. I actually wrote an essay that I gave at the Society for Pentecostal Studies back in March where I use that as an example of how that's something you have to avoid, because anytime you read any text, you're interpreting it. Now, obviously some interpretations are better than others, and that's what we need to argue about and try and figure out as to, is the functionalist view that you're giving of Genesis, is that a better interpretation than, say, another one that some other theistic evolutionist or ID proponent might put out? That's the discussion we need to be having, but we're all interpreting the text, and we need to compare our interpretations and figure out which one's the best and which one's wrong. And they don't really seem to grasp that they're doing that. They seem to have missed the basic English lesson that you're interpreting the text when you read it.
Right, and it's the height of arrogance I get from some young earth creationists when they equate their reading with God's word. They'll say, well, if you don't agree with me, you're denying God's word. No, I don't agree with you, and I'm denying your word. Maybe your interpretation is just wrong. You know, a lot of young earth creationists are not flat earthers, and flat earthers take a far more literal reading of the text. So are they denying God's word because they don't take an absolute literal reading? Are we? Just go to one verse, Romans 5:14. It says, death reigned from Adam to Moses. Who takes that literally? No one, because people still die today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If they were going to say that about something like, I don't know, you deny that Christ died on the cross and was resurrected. Okay, I'll give you that if somebody who denies that is, in a certain sense, denying God's word, because you'd have to be an idiot to read the Gospels and come away and say that's not what it says. But and something like Genesis, where there's a lot more, obviously just a lot more metaphor and a lot more, fluidity is probably the wrong word, but it's not as immediately clear and obvious what the text is trying to say as it is when you read the Gospels.
Right, and it also comes to hermeneutics. It's very clear that the Gospels are written as historical accounts of an actual guy that died and rose from the dead. Genesis is not written within the same category, so we could keep that in mind.
Yeah. This is kind of a side note, but do you have a assessment as to what kind of literature you think the early chapters of Genesis are? I've tried to think about that a little bit, and it seems kind of odd to me. Like, it doesn't seem like it fits in any other categories.
Exactly. I agree completely. It's hard to put it in a category because it doesn't fit within our modern categories.
Yeah. When I was doing some teaching on scripture at a church I attended a couple of years ago, I said, Genesis was one of the odd ones because there's elements here that appear historical. There's elements here that appear like poetry, and there's elements here that our modern eyes would want to look at as mythological, and it's all kind of mixed together, especially in those first couple chapters. When you start getting into like Abraham, it definitely starts appearing far more historical and less of these other things, but the first couple of chapters, it's just like a mix of all these things.
Right, and I also want to point out, I do think Adam and Eve really did exist. I don't deny that they were not real people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you put a video out on that either this week or last week. Is that right?
That's correct. It was last week.
Okay, yeah. That was pretty good. I enjoyed that one. So I guess, I'm trying to think of where to go. So how would you respond to like some of the theological problems people attempt to raise to evolution being compatible with Genesis? Like, people would say, well, it makes human beings somewhat lesser, maybe not made in the image of God, but lesser if they aren't made in a special creation or something along those lines. Because that's one of the other, I'd say, more promising lines of attack I've heard for Christians against evolution is to say, well, there's evidence for it, but if you buy into it, then you've got all these various theological problems because so much of Christian theology depends on what happens in Genesis 1 and 2.
Well, I would remind people that, first of all, I'm going through a series to address a lot of this. And a lot of that results from a lot of misreading, ideas of misreading Scripture with Western eyes. So a lot of people want to posit this idea that there was this perfect paradise and then sin changed the world to where there's death and suffering. That's not really inherent in the Hebrew of Genesis 1 and 2. For example, it says Eve is a helper to Adam. And scholars, when they look at the Hebrew word for that, kind of scratch their heads going, this is an odd word. Why would they use this here? Because when it shows up in other places in Scripture, it more or less refers to a military sustainer. So Eve is like a military captain for Adam. If the world is perfect, why is there military terminology used? God says in Genesis 1 to subdue creation, subdue and rule over it. If God made it perfect to begin with, why is he telling humans that they need to go out and subdue it? What's wrong with creation? So, like, this idea that it was this perfect paradise is just not really inherent in the text. The idea is that God has sort of elected humans to a chief position, to work with God, to bring creation to a better point, to bring order to creation. See, God is not a God who likes to just do everything for us, create like this planetarium for his pet humans to exist in. He gave the Great Commission to us to go out and do. He's not going to do it for us. God wants to work through you. He doesn't want to do it for you. So God in Genesis 1 is doing kind of the same thing. He's saying, humans, come work with me. I have a great idea. We're going to make this planet into a much better place. I want you to help me do it. God wants to work through people. And that's the same thing you see in the New Testament.
Yeah, and I would say that's in keeping with the relationship I have had with God in my own life, where, yeah, he's giving me direction and saying, this is what you need to go do, but he's not snapping his fingers and making it all better all of a sudden. He's saying, no, you need to go do this, and here's what you need to do, and I'll give you a little help if you need it and push you in the right direction, but you need to do it. I'm not going to do it all for you. You're not going to learn anything. You're not going to grow. You're not going to be better. You're not going to mature if I just do it all for you.
Right. And that's one thing we need to think of when we realize how God acts. So young earth creationists have a very odd view that doesn't really match with the rest of Scripture when you look at Genesis 1. It wasn't a paradise. The text says the creation needs subdued. So that's something people need to keep in mind. The garden in Eden was perfect because that's where God resided. And humans are sort of kicked out of that back into the rough, wild wilderness.
Mm-hmm. So if this is drawing a little bit off the video you made, but so you think Eden was definitely an actual place, not like a mythological projection of some like unobtainable good that we just never had. It was an actual place where God resided, and there really were, Adam and Eve really were there, and there really was like a tree of knowledge, good and evil, and a tree of life, and so on and so forth. And it was like a temple or a physical manifestation of God's presence on earth, probably to like a much greater degree than like the later temple that the Hebrews built was.
Right. It was a place God met. He planted a garden in this area called Eden, and then he called two humans to be the priests in there, Adam and Eve. Those are the names we give them.
Okay, good. Yeah, and for people who want to know, that you talked about that a lot more in the video you put up on your channel last week. Okay, good deal. Well, I think that's pretty much all the questions I've run through. We didn't wind up talking about ID as much as I thought we would, because from what you said, a lot of the critiques and stuff I laid out, they just aren't relevant anymore. So no sense in talking about that. Are there any other like related issues or topics you want to touch on here before we start wrapping up?
So in October, I'll get to a video on Genesis 3, specifically the fall. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to talk about, so people always bring up Romans 5, where it says, death spread to all humans when sin happened. And so people go, aha, see, there was no death prior to this. And that's not really what the text says. See, people cherry pick that verse out of Romans 5 because really Paul is talking about spiritual death here. He's not talking about physical, actual death, because Romans 5:14 says death reigned from Adam to Moses. He obviously doesn't mean physical death there. And if you read verses like 17 to 18, he says, for if because of one man's trespasses death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive an abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. Therefore, as one trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all men. Now, obviously, in those two verses, life is metaphorical. It's spiritual life, because we're alive now, and people that are not Christians are still alive. But Paul's talking about spiritual life and spiritual death here. So spiritual death spread to all humans when Adam sinned. It wasn't physical death. So people tend to quote mine or cherry pick this passage, and that tends to be what they use when they want to say that death did not exist prior to Adam. But this is obviously quote mined.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, that's a problem I've noticed with a lot of various types of interpretation of Scripture, where you can, if you take it out of context, you can find any verse to support pretty much anything. The most hilarious example of that I ever saw is something like, it was on like an inspirational calendar that said, all this I will give you if you bow down and worship me. But it was Satan who said that. So
exactly.
Okay, cool. I just had a question that occurred to me, and maybe you can tell me if you're not comfortable answering it because you haven't done the research or something, that's fine. But are you going to try and get into what the Nephilim were or anything like that? Because that's coming up in what you're starting to get to in Genesis. It's pretty soon.
Yes, I will do a video on that in December of 2019. Mm-hmm. I don't think they were descendants of angels, so I'm going to make a case against that. I'm going to argue that basically what Genesis 6 is talking about is picking up right where Genesis 4 left off. So you have a break with the genealogies, but you pick up where the story left off. And how does it end? Well, it mentions this guy named Lamech starts becoming polygamous. Interesting. So I'm going to argue Genesis 6, the sons of gods are kings or rulers of humans, and they started becoming polygamous, and they produced offspring, men of the name, Nephilim, men renowned. It actually translates to men of the name. Okay, so people that were prideful, trying to make a name for themselves. That would explain why God sent the flood, because people were full of themselves. They were violent. They only cared about themselves, not God's will. So you have polygamy, which God doesn't like. You have violence. You have people that are filled with pride. So I don't think there's anything supernatural going on in this verse. And it's pretty obvious, because Genesis 2 says, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they took them as many as they chose. Then look what verse 3 does. It clarifies that. God says, my spirit should not abide with man forever. For he is flesh. Okay, obviously who God is mad at is humans, not humans and divine beings.
Okay, interesting, yeah. I studied that years and years ago before I ever got into, like, good philosophical and theological studies. And, like, I remember reading that and thinking, well, it seems like the most obvious reading of this is that there was something supernatural going on, but I could never quite square that with the verse you just cited, which is God saying, well, my spirit's not going to contend with man forever, because that doesn't fit with that interpretation. And so, but you wanted something that fits everything. So, okay, fascinating. Good deal. All right. Well, I guess that about wraps it up. Thanks again for coming on and talking about all these issues and being an advocate for theistic evolution. I really appreciate it. Anything else you want to say before we stop recording?
No, I think we covered a lot of good things. And if you want more, you can check out my website, inspiringphilosophy.org.
Okay, yeah. And by all means, go check out his YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy, and if you can, go support him on Patreon so he can make more videos, because he always keeps putting out good stuff, and I support him, and you should too. So if you enjoyed this, write in, let me know. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and I've got a Facebook group for the podcast as well, just the Examined Life with Phil. Write in and let me know what you think about Michael's presentation of theistic evolution. What do you think about his functionalist interpretation of Genesis? Any one of these issues, I'm happy to hear from you. And if you enjoy this podcast, as always, give me a like or review on whatever podcast service you listen to it on, whether it's iTunes or Spotify or whatever, and share it on social media to get it out to more people. And if you don't like it, by all means, please write in and give me some good criticism so I can make it better, or just stop listening. So thanks again, and I'll talk to you guys again next week. Okay, well, despite me giving the tags and how to reach the podcast and whatnot, that is actually not the end of this podcast. Sorry for the false ending there. I just recorded that at the end of Michael and I's conversation, because I always do that at the end of when I record with a guest of any kind. But because of how the length of the conversation went, it wasn't going to turn out to be about an hour. So now I'm going to do another segment on philosophers you should know about. And this time we're getting to the philosopher that I consider my favorite, if not one of my favorites, which is Aristotle. He's the third of the Greek trinity of philosophy, the other two being Socrates and Plato. And he lived from about 384 BC to 322 BC, basically, give or take a bit. He was a student of Plato, who himself was a student of Socrates, and Aristotle actually taught and tutored Alexander the Great. Now, depending on which historical commentator you read, this was either a very, very wonderful thing or an absolute disaster that he taught Alexander the Great. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you can get into with that I'll just gloss over, because it's a well-known fact that he taught Alexander the Great, but what more came of it, who knows? Now, if you look at the show page for the Examined Life with Phil, that's a picture of Aristotle and Plato talking in that famous painting by Raphael, The School of Athens. And in that painting, it depicts many Greek philosophers. It's a great painting and, great fresco. And as far as I know, the original's still in the Vatican, and you've probably seen images of it all over the internet and other places besides my show page. Now, Aristotle's probably the only philosopher who can claim to rival Plato in terms of his influence. It was about 1,500 years after Aristotle lived and died that Thomas Aquinas referred to him as simply, quote, the philosopher, with a capital P. Aristotle did early scientific work in what we now call biology and zoology. He wrote about history, poetry, rhetoric, ethics, physics, geology, astronomy, psychology, and most importantly, he gave us the basic rules of logic. Now, unfortunately, Aristotle is also where philosophy starts getting hard to understand. Typically, when you start learning philosophy, whether it's in undergraduate class in college or somewhere else, most people want to start you off with Socrates for obvious reasons, and it's fairly easy to grasp most of what he's getting at. Then you move on to Plato, and although some of his concepts are a little difficult and hard, he tends to write in dialogue, so he's still easy to read. Aristotle, on the other hand, his concepts are difficult and he's often hard to read. And this may or may not be his fault. And the reason for this is that the works we have of Aristotle that survive were, quote, not intended for popular publication. They were rather written works which circulated among the members of Aristotle's school, and that's a quote from Ralph McInerny. McInerny's point there is that the works of Aristotle we have are not completed works, but they're something more along the lines of lecture notes. So, for example, I've done a couple of podcasts here where I didn't write out like a whole essay and read it. Rather, I had a collection of notes and I just kind of worked extemporaneously and with my notes so I would remember, I need to talk about this, there's this point, and so on and so forth. And so likely the works we have of Aristotle that survive are something closer to that. So I think it's probably reasonable to suppose that if Aristotle had been trying to convince the uninitiated of his ideas, he'd have argued for them in a more detailed manner and used analogies and examples to help us understand. If I'm trying to make the points I'm making in the podcast, I'm not going to just hand you those notes I worked from. I'm going to explain things in detail, and if I'm expecting you to read it, I'm going to write it all out as opposed to just handing you those notes. And so that's probably a large part of the reason why Aristotle is difficult to read, is we're working off of his, so to speak, notes, rather than something more like a completed persuasive argument. Now, there also is some evidence from other ancient sources that suggests that Aristotle did write some dialogues like those of Plato, but that these works have been lost to the ravages of time. So, if you're ever poking around an old library or monastery and find a dialogue that says, by Aristotle, on it somewhere, well, just grab it and run as fast as you can to the nearest university or museum. You'll probably get an awful lot of money for that. Or better yet, box it up and send it over to me. I would absolutely adore reading any of those dialogues written by Aristotle, if they still exist anywhere. Now, if you do a search for Aristotle, like in images and stuff online, you'll often see something along the lines of A equals A, and that can be written in a sentence or mathematically. And that's because Aristotle's greatest contribution is that he formally identified and categorized the basic laws of logic. Now, this is not just a contribution to philosophy, but to all of human knowledge, as there's virtually no discipline of human knowledge that doesn't depend on logic. His influence here is so profound that 2,000 years later, Immanuel Kant said that with Aristotle, logic had reached its completion. Now, since that time, since Immanuel Kant, within the last 100 years or so, there have been developments in modal logic that Aristotle was unaware of, so Kant was wrong about that. But still, think about that. 2,000 years later, one of the most preeminent philosophers ever looks back at Aristotle and says, yeah, he did it all. Now, because of his contributions in logic, some people have thus said that Aristotle was not only a great philosopher, but the founder of science. Now, depending on your view of logic, and the very idea that there are views of logic came much, much later than Aristotle, this either means that Aristotle discovered and categorized the laws of logic, similar to how scientists will now discover and categorize, say, species of animals, or he created and formulated the laws of logic. Now, this gets into a philosophical debate that came well over, probably about 2,100 years later than Aristotle, but it's worth noting the distinction because if, like me, you think that Aristotle discovered and categorized logic, then it means that Aristotle gave us the very basis of rational thought. Now, I don't mean by this that no one before Aristotle was rational or thought about things rationally, but rather formalizing the logic like he did enabled us to discriminate between good and bad arguments by more than just our own intuition. There was now a system, a formula in place by which we could do that. This is a bit like how germ theory radically advanced medicine. Things like viruses, bacteria, fungi, and so on, well, they existed long before germ theory, and sometimes the ancient physicians would manage to do things that conform to germ theory, and thus help their patients get better. But it was only after we realized that germs existed that we were then able to properly deal with them, or at least start understanding how to properly deal with them. Likewise with Aristotle and logic. Now, if you take the other view that Aristotle formulated or created the rules of logic, then there's something entirely different going on here, but I'll have to get into that at a later time with a later philosopher. And hopefully that'll happen, in this case, quicker than 2100 years from now. So, the laws of logic, according to Aristotle, then there's three main ones. They are roughly, 1, the law of identity, and that is, a thing is itself and it is not itself at the same time and in the same context. So this is simple enough. A rock is a rock and it is not a non-rock at the same time and in the same context. So you heat a rock up enough and it might melt into magma, so it's different, but you change the context by adding heat to the mix. Or you could bash and grind the rock down into sand, but again, you change the context by bashing it and grinding it down. A rock cannot and will never be both a rock and magma or sand at the same time and in the same context. Things are themselves and they are not other things. A thing or proposition cannot remain unchanged and have its meaning or content changed. This principle probably just seems so intuitively obvious to you that you might wonder why it even needs to be said or given a name. And if you are thinking that way, it shows just how pervasive Aristotle's influence is. Because if you start looking at some, say, pre-Socratic philosophers or some Eastern philosophers, this principle is not as intuitively obvious to them. But it probably is to you, because I'm assuming most of the people listening to my podcast here are, like myself, Western Americans or Europeans who are steeped in Aristotelian logic, because that's how pervasive its influence has been. So the second law is the law of the excluded middle, and that is, if A or B, then either only A or only B, not both. So a simple proposition is either true or false, not both, and there are no degrees in between the two. A thing either exists or it does not exist. It never both exists and does not exist at the same time and in the same sense. So, easy example, I'm either alive or dead. Not both, and there are no degrees between the two. There is the useful distinction I like to make here to help people understand this between complex and simple propositions. Complex propositions are often said to be, say, slightly true or false or a mix thereof, but that's because a complex proposition contains more than one claim. A simple proposition is something like, Aristotle was Greek, with Greek here being the nationality, whereas a complex proposition is something like, Aristotle was a Greek philosopher who wrote Nicomachean Ethics and educated Alexander the Great. Now, I think it should be immediately obvious to you that the second proposition I said is actually a composition of many individual propositions. That is, it's claiming that Aristotle was Greek, a philosopher, the author of Nicomachean Ethics, the teacher of Alexander the Great. Now, any one of those claims could be true or false, and that's why it's a complex proposition, whereas all those individual ones I'm labeling a simple proposition. And if you get into formal philosophy, they don't spell this distinction out quite like this, but this is the general idea. A simple proposition is just a simple claim, and it is necessarily either true or false. A single claim is either true or false, not both, and there are not any amount of degrees between the two. Now, this is an important distinction to keep in mind because most things in the real world are actually complex propositions. That is, there's usually a whole lot of various claims and ideas and evaluations and procedures going on. That's why it's very important to define things and try and break it down to simple propositions. Easy example of this, ask somebody if they think evolution is true. Well, there's a whole lot of different definitions that can be given of evolution, and any single one of those is actually a combination of many different claims, many different simple propositions, any one of which needs to be evaluated and their truth or falsity evaluated on its own. So if anybody tries to give you a simple answer to that, they're either being partisan, they don't want to talk to you, or they're being dishonest. It's complicated. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have Michael Jones on to talk about theistic evolution, because as by now you well know, he was willing to dig into the dirt and the minutiae and try and figure it all out and go through and dissect all the various claims, as opposed to some other people who will just make those flat-out statements like, oh, you're a fool for not believing in evolution, or, oh, you're a fool for believing in it. It's much more complicated than that, as I hope you can see from the discussion Michael and I had. But the point I'm making here is, once things are broken down to these simple propositions, then claims are either true or false. And that's the second law, is things are either true or false, the law of the excluded middle. The third law is the law of contradiction, or it's sometimes called the law of non-contradiction. In formal philosophy, this one is called the law of contradiction, but in casual or normal speech, people call it the law of non-contradiction. And all this means is that contradictions do not exist. Period. I.e., the two favorite examples of philosophers like me are that a square circle and a married bachelor are contradictions and as such do not exist. The definition of a square and the definition of a circle necessarily contradict each other, and so a square circle cannot exist. The definition of a bachelor and the definition of being married necessarily contradict each other, and so a married bachelor cannot exist. Contradictions do not exist. A controversial example that could help you understand this, and I guess this is rehashing a little bit of Michael and I's side discussion on philosophy of mind, but I think it's a good example here nonetheless. There's an idea that's popular in philosophy of mind called emergentism, which is the idea that as the human brain gets more and more and more complicated, eventually the immaterial mind just emerges from that lower material. And I look at that and I think, no, that's a contradiction. Material and immaterial are by definition contradictions. So there's a paradox going on there. There's a contradiction. So I look at that and think, based on Aristotle's third law of logic, that absolutely cannot work. You're never going to get immaterial from material simply by definition. The two contradict each other. Now, that's a minority opinion, I'll freely admit. Emergentism is very, very popular in philosophy of mind today, but I think that violates the basic rules of logic, and hopefully that helps you understand the point of Aristotle's third law here. Now, a further explanation that I think might be necessary is you often do find contradictions arising in speech. So, for example, the rules of English grammar will allow me to speak and write about something like the sound of one hand clapping. But this is nothing more than a meaningless combination of words. Clapping, by definition, requires two or more hands. So it's impossible for one hand to clap, and thus there is no sound of one hand clapping. Not only is there nothing in existence which can be the referent of the phrase, the sound of one hand clapping, but it's impossible for there to even be such a thing, as it violates the law of non-contradiction. Thus, it's not logically possible that it could apply to anything. So, the sound of one hand clapping is what I would call a non-thing. That is, it's something that you can put in grammar, but that can't actually exist. It's a contradiction. Now, these contradictions or impossible things aren't truly things in any meaningful sense of thing, as their existence violates the most basic laws of reasoning, and that's why I think it's more appropriate to refer to them as non-things. They're entities that you can kind of put into grammar, but that just don't actually exist. In fact, you can't even really think about them if you're being honest, I would say. Now, you'll see people list Aristotle's laws in different orders and state them a little differently, and that's not terribly important. The important thing is that you get the ideas behind them. And I think you can just intuitively also see that any single one of these rules just imply the other two. If the law of identity is true, then so are the laws of the excluded middle and non-contradiction. If the law of non-contradiction is true, then so are the laws of identity and the excluded middle, and so on. Now, I've thought about it a little bit as to whether or not this means any of these laws are reducible to the others, and the fact that they imply each other so readily seems to suggest that, but I've never managed to figure out a way to, break it down to one single rule of logic. And other philosophers have been working on this far, far longer than I've been alive. People have been trying to do that since Aristotle, and so far nobody's come up with a better way to do it. So, it's probably not possible, but intuitively you almost would want to go there since they imply each other so well. Now, Aristotle regarded these laws as the very basis for all rational thought, and went so far as to say that any person who denies them is no better than a vegetable. He said, quote, "And if he makes no judgment, but thinks and does not think indifferently, what difference will there be between him and a vegetable?" Later on, some other philosophers like the great Gottfried Leibniz and the contemporary philosopher Alexander Proust, who's also an exceptionally great philosopher, they've attempted to argue for a fourth rule of logic that they call the principle of sufficient reason, or the PSR. This, loosely speaking, states that everything that exists has a reason for its existence, i.e. there are no brute facts and nothing exists just because, but everything has some reason for its existence. Now, this is much, much more controversial than Aristotle's laws, and some people argue vehemently against the PSR, but in my personal opinion, I think the PSR is probably onto something. There might be some ways to state it better or make it a little clearer, but something about the PSR intuitively seems kind of right to me. This idea that, as I said, everything that exists has some reason for its existence. Now, Aristotle is also known for his four causes, which, very simple, very easy to understand. They're just the four most basic questions you can ask about anything. What is it? What is it made out of? Where did it come from? And what is it for? And these are the formal cause, the material cause, the efficient cause, and the final or the teleological cause. Now, the formal cause is actually the most obscure and difficult to get your head around if you haven't done this type of philosophy before, so I'm going to explain that one last because it's actually easier for you to understand it once you understand the other three. So the material cause is simply what something's made out of. So a wooden chair's material cause is wood. A statue's material cause is the stone, marble, or whatever the statue's made out of, and so on. The efficient cause is the origin of the thing. So for the chair, it's the carpenter or the machine or whoever it was who made it. For the statue, it's the sculptor who carved it, and so on. And this is what we usually mean by cause in normal English speech. In this sense, I caused the omelet I ate for lunch today because, well, I cooked it on the stove and I made it. Now, the final or teleological cause is the question to what the thing's purpose is. So for the chair, it's something to sit on. For the statue, it's artistic. And for my omelet, it was my lunch. Now, things can also have multiple final causes. The chair is something to sit on, but maybe the carpenter carved it to earn money, or he might have had some artistic purposes in mind if he designs it in an artistic way. And it's also possible for things to have multiple efficient and multiple material causes. A movie is made by many different people. You have the writers, the directors, the actors, the producers, and so on. A car is made out of many different types of material: metal, plastic, rubber, leather, sometimes some other synthetic cloths, and so on. Now, the formal cause, which again is the most difficult to understand, the formal cause is just what the thing is. Now, while this shares a name with Plato's forms, the Aristotelian formal cause is a very different thing than a Platonic form. The formal cause of a chair is the chair. The formal cause of the statue is the statue, and so on. Now, you're probably having trouble getting this, so just think of the fact that in order for a thing to exist, it needs to have a shape. So the wood that is the material cause of the chair needs a shape in order to be a chair, and that shape is part of or like the formal cause. Now, Aristotle thought that there is much more to the formal cause than just its shape. Rather, he thought the metaphysics and all the other stuff that goes into it comes into that too. So, wrapped up in my formal cause of being a man is not just my shape, but also what's my purpose in being a man? How do I think? And things like that. Probably a slightly easier example to follow is that a dog's formal cause wouldn't just be its shape, but also, say, its nature, or that is, its dogness. It's the thing that makes a dog a dog. So there are some metaphysical aspects to this, as I just said. Now, I think this immediately raises other questions, like if we have general formal causes, specific formal causes, or both. That is, do I have the formal cause of being a human being, or the formal cause of being Phil, or both? Do I have the formal cause of being Phil, the formal cause of being a man, or both? Now, I'm not going to get into those questions here because it gets pretty deep into metaphysics, but suffice to say, Aristotle did work out a whole system to answer this question and the numerous other ones that arise from it. And it seems to me that at a very basic level, Aristotle's four causes or questions here work very, very well, but then things get a bit more dicey when we try and spell out the details and build up a whole giant metaphysical system that would answer every conceivable question that could arise. That is, I would say, the higher we go, the shakier our metaphysical buildings get. And that's a disagreement I've got with many forms of philosophical systems, where I think the more grounded and simple we keep our metaphysics, the better. And when you try and build them up in order to make them answer all these inevitable questions that arise, then the system starts getting very, very shaky and unstable. So just as an example of how all this stuff can work out, if you recall back when I talked about Plato, I talked about what the problem of universals was and Plato's answer to it. Aristotle actually had a very, very different answer to the problem of universals than Plato did. Plato basically constructed this huge metaphysical system, and then his student Aristotle came along and threw the whole thing out. And if you don't know what the problem of universals is, I refer you back to episode 31 at the end there. It started with me talking to Father Randy Soto about inerrancy, but at the end of it I went through discussing Plato, and I discussed what the problem of universals is there. So go back and listen to that if you don't know what I'm talking about, you hear. Now, you can actually see the distinction between Plato and Aristotle here in Raphael's fresco, The School of Athens, which is the image for this show here, where Plato's pointing up toward the heavens and his forms to ground philosophy, while Aristotle is gesturing down toward the earth as he wants to ground universals in the particulars. That is, to Aristotle, universals are not found in the forms, but are abstracted off of the particulars. So, here's how this works. We see the color gray on, say, an elephant in a battleship. Now, even though we only see gray on the particulars, like the elephant in the battleship, our minds recognize the common or universal nature of the property being gray that these two things share. And our minds will also pick up on this property on all other things that have the property of being gray. So what Aristotle concluded is that the universal gray exists within our minds as an abstract construct of all the times we have seen gray in the real world. This idea is loosely called moderate realism, as it says that universals really do exist, and they're grounded in the particulars. Now, if you're not used to this type of abstract thinking, it can be kind of hard to get your head around at first. It was really, really difficult for me when I first started studying Aristotle anyway. Fortunately, the internet has actually given us what I think is a very great analogy of moderate realism here. Now, you know the internet exists because you get my podcast over the internet and you're listening to this. But where is the internet located? Where is it? Now just think about that for a minute. And that should be a very hard question for you to answer because the internet doesn't quite exist in the same way that something like chairs and rocks do. Rather, what the internet is a construct of all the individual computers, servers, and infrastructure and so on that make it up. You could take a few of the computers and servers away from the internet and add some to it, and it still exists. And that's happening every day as internet companies rise up and fall away, as people log on and log off. It's a construct of all these individuals that are coming together to make the whole. So you could say that the internet is grounded in the particulars of the individual computers, servers, infrastructure, and so on that make it up. And this is somewhat analogous to how Aristotle thought a universal, in this example the color gray, is grounded in the particulars of that universal. The battleship, the elephant, other things that are gray like my car, and so on. Now, I think this has the added benefit of explaining how it is that we can learn things. That is, every time I see another universal, it adds to the conception of that universal that my mind already has, and thus I get a better understanding of that universal. Now, this doesn't seem very important for something like, say, the color gray, but it's very important for the universal of something like, say, human being. The more human beings I meet, the more I learn and understand what it means to be a human being and what humans are like. Now, I think this gives some great philosophical support to that famous maximum that most bigotry is based in ignorance. The more human beings I meet, the more I realize human beings are diverse in looks and appearance and things like that, and there's not cause for bigotry because those are other human beings, even if they look different than I do. Now, Aristotle did lots and lots of other things in philosophy as well. He developed the golden mean, which argues that the middle response between two extremes is the right thing to do, which I've talked about on the podcast before here. I.e., when I'm confronted with danger, I shouldn't be so terrified that I freeze into inaction, nor should I be so brave that I act impulsively or foolishly. I should be in the middle where I can act appropriately. And there's some trouble and problems with that, but as a rule of thumb, I think it works very well, that most of the time, the virtuous action is probably going to be something like the middle between the two extremes. Aristotle also gave one of the very first cosmological arguments for the existence of God through his unmoved mover argument, and I talked about that in detail way back at the end of podcast number 13, so if you want to know some more about that there, go listen to it. Loosely speaking, it's the first argument, it's a pretty decent one, but there's some much, much better ones nowadays, like the Leibnizian cosmological argument or the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, Aristotle also gave a very clever definition of time, which we now know almost for certain must be wrong. And this is pretty relevant because I was talking with Alan Rhoda and Philip Swenson about time quite a bit in the past couple of weeks. Now, Aristotle defined time as a moment that has both a before and an after. And this is just intuitively, I'm sure you can see, a very, very good definition, because if you think about time, it is something that more or less seems to have a moment before and a moment after. But I think we now know that everything, that is the universe, time, matter, and even physical space, came into existence at the Big Bang. We've got some very good scientific evidence for that. There's very good philosophical There's very good philosophical arguments that show that things can't go infinite into the past. So what that means is there was a first moment of time. That is, there was a moment of time that had an after, but not a before. But it still must have been time. So therefore, even though Aristotle's definition is, again, very clever and good, and I think it works pretty much every place except for that very first moment of time, well, we know it has to be wrong because it doesn't work for that very first moment of time. And in fact, based on his definition of time, Aristotle thought that time was infinite into the past and into the future. But we now know, unfortunately, he got this one wrong. These days, you can find, I think, all of Aristotle's works online, but they're pretty difficult to read if you don't already do philosophy and aren't already used to reading this type of stuff. If you want to start reading his stuff directly, I'd have to recommend you start on something like Nicomachean Ethics, as it's just so much easier to follow and grasp than if you're starting with physics or metaphysics. Physics and metaphysics are like a basis for Aristotelian philosophy and much of the good stuff that came later, but they're just really hard to grasp without somebody explaining it to you if you haven't already done a lot of stuff in philosophy. Best thing to do, I'd say, though, is get a good book that explains Aristotle to you. Mortimer J. Adler has an excellent one called Aristotle for Everybody that explains Aristotle's metaphysics and his systems of thought in a remarkably clear fashion. He's going to explain what Aristotle's talking about in physics and metaphysics in a way that pretty much everybody can grasp and understand. And so, loosely speaking, that's kind of a foundation to who Aristotle was and why his philosophy was so incredibly important. Mostly it's because he's the one who gave us the very laws of logic, and that's the foundation by which we all have to reason. So I've found the more I've studied Aristotle, I'm pretty Aristotelian in my thought, and if you stuck a gun to my head and said which school of philosophy to align with, I'd probably go with Aristotle, although he was wrong about some stuff. But the way he approached things and the way he did his systems of thought, it seems to work very, very well almost all the time to me. Just not all the time, but no system of philosophy works all the time. Okay, so no false ending this time. This actually is the end of the podcast. I won't go through and reiterate all the questions I asked at the end of Michael and I's discussion. Just reiterate again that to get in touch with me about any comments of any kind, you can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or you can leave comments on the Facebook page, The Examined Life with Phil. Just do a search for that, and I'll be happy to respond to anything that comes in. Thanks again for listening, and I'll be back again next week with my interview with Dr. J.P. Moreland about his book, Finding Quiet.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.